like to commence by acknowledging our heritage and on behalf of all participants, acknowledge the traditional owners of the land upon which we meet. We note the continuing connections of all Australian Aboriginal and Torres Strait Island people to the land, sea and community where we live, learn and work. We pay our respects to the elders, past, present and emerging, and we extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Island people. My name is Dr. Patricia Jenkins, President of the United Nations Association of Australia, New South Wales. Thank you for joining our commemorative service to acknowledge United Nations Day 2021 and to commemorate all those who have served with the United Nations. The UN was formed on the 24th of October 1945, and for over 75 years it has been supported by its 193 member states to create a safer, fairer and more sustainable world. Each year, the United Nations Association of Australia New South Wales holds a commemorative wreath-laying service at the Cenotaph in Martin Place in the centre of the City of Sydney to acknowledge the service and sacrifice of peacekeepers from Australia and all over the world who work tirelessly to protect some of the most vulnerable population across the globe. We gather to recognise the wonderful work by young men and women, civilian, military and police that contribute to international peace and security. This year, due to the restrictions emanating from the COVID-19 pandemic, we have not been able to organise a public ceremony at the Cenotaph. We've not given up though, but we've produced this virtual service in lieu, which we hope you will enjoy. This service will commence with acknowledgement of country and include messages from our patron, Her Excellency, the Honourable Margaret Beazley, AC, QC, Governor of New South Wales, followed by an address from Major General Cheryl Pearce, AM, a former UN force commander in Cyprus, and a representation of our wreath-laying and commemorative service. On United Nations Day 2021, and while we tackle unprecedented challenges, let us, we the peoples, reaffirm our commitment to make peace a reality and help create a better world for all in the wonderful spirit of humanitarian mateship. Thank you.
Wujiri Gamarua, Dian Babana Gamarara, Gadigal Nagara. In the language of the Gadigal people, the traditional owners of the land on which Government House Sydney stands, I convey my greetings to the United Nations Association of Australia New South Wales and pay my respects to elders, past, present and emerging. 76 years ago, on the 24th of October 1945, the United Nations Charter came into force, prefaced by those resonant first words, "We, the peoples of the United Nations." It was a statement of unity born out of adversity. The Charter established for all nations the principles of international law that would henceforth govern the relationships of nations in matters of international justice, economic and social cooperation, security and peace. In 1954, reflecting the optimism of that time, the United Nations Association of Japan donated to the United Nations the Japanese Peace Bell. Twice each year and on other significant occasions, the Japanese Peace Bell tolls its message of peace. In 1994, on the 40th anniversary of that gift to the world, then Secretary-General Boutros Boutros-Ghali said, "Whenever it has sounded, this Japanese Peace Bell has sent a clear message. The message is addressed to all humanity. Peace is precious. It is not enough to yearn for peace. Peace requires work, long, hard, difficult work." The proliferation of conflict, or perhaps more accurately, the absence of peace, in a world where many survive but do not thrive, is both the failure and the challenge of our times. The absence of peace not only causes problems for humanity, it compounds other serious problems which the world is facing. Earlier this year, in his vision statement for the United Nations for the next 5 years, entitled Restoring Trust and Inspiring Hope, Secretary-General Antonio Guterres made the point that we've reached an important inflection point in history, a genuine moment of truth. The choices we make now will determine our trajectory for decades to come. That inflection point of which the Secretary-General spoke is the vulnerability of the global community. Vulnerability which has been compounding arguably over decades, but which has certainly become concentrated over the last number of years. There are armed conflicts in over 36 countries in the world. There are over 82 million refugees in the world, a direct consequence of continuing conflicts between, but more particularly within nations. There are schools and villages from which young girls are abducted. We see the faces of famine-wrenched children nightly on our television screens. The status and safety of women in many countries is precarious. The future of women in Afghanistan is of particular concern, with the Ministry of Women's Affairs disbanded and women excluded from the new governmental arrangements under the Taliban. In his vision statement, the Secretary-General spoke of other global issues, including climate change, pollution, severe regression in the world's biodiversity, dysfunctionality in the power relations between nation-states, a digital world which has revolutionised our communications and connectedness, but, as the Secretary-General reminded us, this increasingly unhinged digital world has a shadowy side. There are skyrocketing inequalities. In the last 2 years, the inequalities of which the Secretary-General spoke have coalesced around the pandemic. For example, as at April 2021, in the scramble for vaccines, developed to protect all of us from the serious health consequences of the pandemic, over 100 countries had not received a single dose. It's therefore a trite observation that international cooperation is as important now as it was in the closing months of the Second World War, when the Charter of the United Nations was signed by representatives of 50 nations in San Francisco, including Australia, a founding signatory. In his speech to mark the commencement of the 76th Assembly of the United Nations, Secretary-General Guterres, reiterating the issues of inequality, climate change and leadership, said, "I'm here to sound the alarm. The world must wake up. We are on the edge of an abyss and moving in the wrong direction." That speech was made on the 21st of September, one of the 2 days in each year when the Japanese peace bell tolls. Let us hope that the entire world heard that call to peace. Peacekeeping and peace building continue to be significant areas of the United Nations work. Peace is, as Boutros Boutros-Ghali said back in 1994, precious, involving long, hard and difficult work. Since 1947, more than 50,000 members of the Australian Defence Force, police and civilian personnel have undertaken that long, hard and difficult work, including in our near neighbour, Timor-Leste. At the end of last year, Major General Cheryl Pearce, who will also speak at today's ceremony, completed her 2-year term as the commander of the United Nations peacekeeping force in Cyprus, leading over 800 military personnel during the COVID-19 pandemic, continuing to contribute to peace and stability across the UN-controlled buffer zone. To all UN peacekeepers, and particularly to the Australian peacekeepers, including the 10 who've lost their lives, today is an occasion for the rest of us to acknowledge your service and to say thank you. In the absence of peace in so many parts of our world, the work of the United Nations, the goodwill it creates, and the commitment of its peacekeepers gives us all hope. As patron of the United Nations Association of Australia, New South Wales branch, thank you for your continued advocacy and education in support of the ever-important work of the United Nations.
Ladies and gentlemen, good morning and thank you for inviting me to join you today. On the 24th of October 1945, 76 years ago, the United Nations officially began after its charter was ratified by the P5 members and followed shortly after by other member states. This outcome was a result of the San Francisco Conference 4 months earlier, for which Australia participated and is a founding member state. The history of the United Nations peacekeeping followed shortly after, formally commencing in 1948. However, 12 months earlier, in 1947, military observers deployed to the field in Indonesia, and Australian military personnel were part of the first unarmed observers on the ground. Peacekeeping missions have adjusted over the decades to meet the operational and member state requirements, with the first two United Nations peacekeeping missions, UNTSO and UNMIGIP, remaining operational today. Australia has had distinguished service across many UN peacekeeping missions and within its New York headquarters. I thank all of those who have contributed and pay my respect to those that have made the ultimate sacrifice. Currently, there are 12 peacekeeping operations employing over 87,000 peacekeepers from 121 member states. Australia is currently serving within 3 of these missions: UNTSO, UNMISS in South Sudan, and MINUSMA in Mali. The political complexity of peacekeeping operations, as well as the scope of the mandates, ensures peacekeeping operations remain dynamic and more necessary than ever. Whilst we cannot join in person today to commemorate UN Day and reflect on our contribution, I can imagine that your thoughts and emotions are similar to mine. I couldn't be more proud to have had the opportunity to wear the UN beret and represent our nation serving under the UN flag. I had the privilege to serve twice in uniform with the United Nations, once as a military observer in East Timor and more recently as the Force Commander UNFICYP. The United Nations force in Cyprus was originally established by the Security Council in 1964 to prevent a reoccurrence of fighting between the Greek Cypriot and Turkish Cypriot communities, to maintain law and order and a return of the island to normal conditions. The original mission saw over 6,000 peacekeepers deployed across the island, which included Australia peacekeeping contributing to the UNPOL mission, a commitment of continuous service until 2017. In 1974, post further intercommunal fighting and resultant sea and air insertion of Turkish forces, the mission refocused on achieving its mandate within the buffer zone established between the two opposing forces on the ceasefire line. UNFICYP today is a multinational, multi-component force of just over 1,000 personnel and who face many of the challenges as the peacekeepers who have gone before them. My observations and experiences as Force Commander from January 19 to January 21 was that the Cyprus problem remains a complex environment, politically, economically, militarily and socially. For many, the clashes in 1974 remain a lived experience, and the divergent political position both sides currently have sees a difficult journey ahead to achieving a peaceful solution. However, I assess that without the peacekeepers creating a presence within the buffer zone, across the island, continually engaging with the opposing forces, the communities that work across the divide, and with the political leaders of both sides, tensions would rise and military and intercommunal clashes reigniting. UNFICYP is a stark reminder on the force multiplying effect that 1,000 unarmed peacekeepers can have on 2 armed opposing forces of over 20,000 each. In closing, I'd like to pay my respects to our leaders and visionaries who saw the strength in a united world through an agreed charter which shall be devoted to making known to the people of the world the aims and the achievements of the United Nations and to gaining their support for its work. Today, United Nations Day, let's take a moment to commemorate our contribution and service and that of our nation as we continue to work in achieving the Charter's intent. Thank you.
and let us rejoice, for we are one and free. We've golden soil and wealth for toil, our home is girt by sea. Our land abounds in nature's gifts of beauty, rich and rare. In history's page let every stage advance Australia fair. In joyful strains that let us sing, advance Australia fair.
Distinguished viewers, guests, ladies and gentlemen, this concludes Sydney's 2021 annual United Nations Day commemorative wreath-laying ceremony, which is normally conducted each year on the nearest working weekday to United Nations Day, 24th of October, to acknowledge United Nations Day and the valiant service of our Navy, Army, Air Force, police peacekeepers and United Nations international civil servants, who have all contributed to the celebration of this very special day in recognising and paying homage to the service of United Nations peacekeeping. My name is Geoffrey Little. I'm a life member of the United Nations Association of New South Wales and the convener, organiser and Master of Ceremonies of Sydney's annual United Nations Day commemorative wreath-laying ceremony, which is held at the Cenotaph in Martin Place, Sydney. In concert with the coordination of a number of earlier invited guests, Masters of Ceremony, I have performed the task of convener and in later years Master of Ceremonies and UN Anthem soloist for the bulk of the 27 years of my stewardship of Sydney's annual United Nations Day commemorative wreath-laying ceremony, 2021, representing the 28th year of my service. Whilst I and we of the United Nations Association of Australia, New South Wales, are disappointed that this year we have not been able to meet in person, I thank you for joining us in this virtual commemorative ceremony. And on your behalf, may I also thank all of those who have helped to make this most splendid video presentation possible, from our patron, Her Excellency, the Honourable Margaret Beazley, AC QC, Governor of New South Wales, Government House staff, and our distinguished guest of honour, Major General Cheryl Ann Pearce, AM, former Force Commander, United Nations Forces in Cyprus. I particularly wish to mention the production team behind this most splendid presentation under the expertise of Mr. Hardeep Gurn, who is accredited with the Australian Film Institute and Screen Producers Australia as a producer, director and new media executive and media partner of the United Nations Association of Australia, New South Wales. I and we of UNAA New South Wales look forward to meeting you all again in person at the Cenotaph in Martin Place, Sydney on Monday, the 24th of October 2022, when the United Nations Association of Australia, New South Wales, plans to hold our annual United Nations Day commemorative wreath-laying ceremony. Thank you, and see you in 2022.